Last year, on Boxing Day, I found a really cool ornament in a clearance box. It had a built-in camera to record a unique perspective on your holiday celebrations. I grabbed the last one from the store's dusty shelf and brought it home for less than $10. I forgot about it until my wife, my 2 daughters, and I decorated the house earlier this month. I told my daughters about the camera and said we'd secretly catch Santa in the act. I had an old costume in the attic and intended to deliver some gifts in full view of the camera on Christmas night. My girls were overjoyed and went back and forth trying to find the best place to put the ornament on the tree. They had no idea Daddy repositioned it later so he could actually catch the living room and a good angle. In the nights leading up to Christmas, I turned the camera on to make sure everything was working properly. Satisfied, I inserted the micro SD card back into the ornament and slipped in a new battery in anticipation for the big night. I didn't want to disappoint my girls with a failed recording. We enjoyed Christmas Eve as a family, playing board games and eating way more junk food than there was room in our stomachs. Like we do every year, we let our daughters open one gift from Mom and Dad before going to bed. The girls, still riding their sugar high, could be heard giggling in their bedroom from all the way up the stairs. From time to time, my wife and I could hear one of them say shush to the other, claiming she had heard hooves on the roof or bells jingling. Eventually, our kiddos did doze off. My wife kissed me on the cheek and headed to bed while I turned off all the lights. I retrieved the costume and tiptoed into the living room, getting ready for my big feature film debut. I did everything you would expect Santa to do. I ate most of the cookies, I drank the milk, I pet my large stomach and I said my ho-ho-hos, and I dropped a few presents by the fireplace. All in full view of the camera. A pretty good acting job if I do say so myself. On Christmas morning, the girls came running into our bedroom to wake us up. They excitedly insisted we watch the video before opening the presents. I transferred my footage to the laptop, and I forwarded it to where Santa showed up, and pressed play. My girls squealed with delight and jumped in front of the screen, frantically waving at Santa while obscuring the video from my view. It brought me so much joy to see how my girls were happy. I was too lazy to stop the video, so it continued to play in the background while we unwrapped our gifts. I spotted a box I hadn't seen the night before. It was small and wrapped in a blue foil paper I did not recognize. My name was on it, but my wife seemed as surprised as I was to see it there. Noticing my confusion, my youngest daughter spoke. "Daddy, that's gotta be from Mr. Elf," she said, her voice cheerful and bright. I was ready to dismiss her elf comment as just another weird thing kids say, but my wife wasn't so quick to ignore it. "Honey, what elf?" she asked. My daughter pointed to the laptop. By then, the video had ended, and all that was left on the screen was a preview of the first frame. "The one that came with Santa," she answered. Panic struck me like a bird in a jet propeller. I know my wife didn't dress up as an elf. I scanned the video, clicking forward and back until I saw what my daughter had seen. There was someone in the living room. He walked into the corner after I had turned the lights off. He stood there watching me parading around as Santa. The video went completely quiet after that. It was as if, though, the camera failed to record a single sound. The strange, tall man in an elf costume stood perfectly still for over an hour, watching the camera from a distance. After a while, he walked over to the plate of cookies and bit the head off of a gingerbread man. I glanced at the plate and saw his teeth mark on the decapitated cookie. The man then quietly approached the Christmas tree. I thought the audio wasn't working, but as he reached the tree, I began hearing his slow and steady breaths. He reached toward the ornament, and the video stopped. In a terrified frenzy, I grabbed the blue box he'd left behind. I ripped the bow off of it and tossed the frilly thing away. I frantically removed the wrapping paper, opened the door, and looked inside. There, on a bed of bubble wrap, was the battery I'd put in the camera the night before. My wife took the ornament and opened the back. The battery was missing. I don't know what scares me more, what the camera caught, or what the elf might have done after he turned off the camera. This is my first post, and first ever day on Reddit, so please bear with me. When I saw Let's Not Meet, I knew I had to share one of my most not-so-pleasant stories. It was Christmas Eve, and I was a freshman in high school. My family has been split for some time, so normally we trade off Christmas Day and Christmas Eve every year, and this year I had come home early from my grandparents' Christmas party while everyone else was at my aunt and uncle's celebrating at another party. When I was dropped off, my cousins offered to stay with me for a few hours, yet I declined. I thought I could watch some of my new DVDs and get some alone time in the house, which is a rarity. I had noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street, but I didn't really think anything of it considering it was Christmas Eve. It was probably just a neighbor's relative or something. After I started to settle down, I hadn't been home for more than 15 minutes when there was a knock at the door. I unlocked the door and opened it only a crack to see a man standing there. Dark hair, glasses, slightly overweight, and dressed casually. He didn't look like much of a threat, but my stomach dropped anyway. He asked, "I was wondering about the car outside. Is it for sale?" I told him I didn't think so. "Is there someone here I can talk to about it?" I said, and quite stupidly I might add, "No, you can come back another time," and shut the door and turned the lock as fast as I possibly could. He reached for the handle immediately and started pounding on the door. I heard a string of profanities and the pounding stopped. Terrified, I was crawling on the floor to the phone, hoping he wouldn't be able to see me through one of the windows. Then I heard the noises. Our house had an open garage door, and it led through to the laundry room, where the door lock was broken and no one had bothered to fix it. Just then I heard a man yell, and I saw the man through the window run to his car and drive off. My uncle had gotten him just in time and scared the man off. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't made it home in time. Sadly, we didn't get the plate number, and nothing ever came of it, but I'll never be home alone on a holiday again. This story takes place 4 years ago, and it still haunts me to this day. It was Christmas night, and my family was driving home from this fancy restaurant. I, unlike my family, wasn't tired, so the 45-minute drive seemed perpetual. On top of that, my little sister was constantly moaning about how her friend didn't get her anything for Christmas. After about 20 minutes of driving, my dad stopped at a gas station to get some cigarettes, and my sister, brother, and mother all got out to pee. I stayed in the car, as I had already gone before we left. Once they all left, I decided to play a few games on my phone. I looked at the car clock and saw that 10 minutes had passed, so I immediately wondered what was taking them so long. As soon as I peered out the car window, I saw a man standing at our car. The man startled me as I didn't know how long he had been watching me. What made it even more unnerving is that he had a plain blank face. No expression was shown. It was hard to make out any features as it was pretty dark, and he wasn't standing in an illuminated part of the station. I would say he was about 5'9" and looked to be middle-aged. Once he saw me notice him, he started walking towards the car, and I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't scared. Luckily, my dad came back with the rest of my family just as the man took a couple steps. My dad apologized and told me he had been in an argument with the cashier. I didn't care, I was just glad that my dad was back with me. I took another glance at the man outside, and he was still staring, but this time he had an annoyed look on his face. We drove off, and for the rest of the car ride, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. This wouldn't have been too bad if it ended there, but it didn't. Later that night, I was watching YouTube while everyone else slept, and luckily for me, a storm was raging over us. I enjoy storms. It makes me feel cozy as I'm lying in the bed. I put my phone down and just enjoyed the ambience. That didn't last long, though, for I heard something smash into the window behind me. I launched forward and nearly fell out of my bed. I thought a bird had just smashed into the window or something. I parted the blinds, and what I saw next haunted me. I saw a man standing out by my parents' cars, looking up at my room. I took a closer look and I nearly had a heart attack. It was the same man that I had seen at the gas station. Only this time, when our eyes met, he grinned. Being the 14-year-old I was, I did the manly thing and screamed at the top of my lungs. My dad came running down the stairs and entered the room. "Why the fuck are you screaming?" he said. I told him about the man and I explained everything that had happened. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and told me to call the police. After 10 minutes, the police turned up outside our house and found the man in our shed. He got arrested, and that was the last time I ever saw him. The next day, my dad inspected the house, and we found the handle of our back door had been damaged, but not completely broken. This gives me an eerie feeling, as if he actually managed to get in, he could have harmed us, or even possibly killed us. Christmas has always been a rough time of year for me. All my friends and classmates were always filled with the festive spirit and excited for a plethora of gifts that sat nestled under their trees. But my Christmases were never like that. My family was broken, mostly thanks to the cruelty of my father. He was a heavy drinker, and what time he didn't spend at the bar he usually spent on tirades against my mother or physical confrontations with my 16-year-old brother Tommy. My father was the kind that never seemed satisfied with anything. My mother's meals were never tasty enough. Tommy's attitude and direction in life wasn't admirable enough. More than once I watched them fight, with my father expelling his wrath upon them both. He broke Tommy's arm twice, and left my mother with multiple scars and bruises. Tommy and I were always close, but as time went on, he came home less and less. My mother slipped further into depression and became more reclusive as a result of the abuse. She never talked about it, just did what she could and tried not to ignite the temper of my father. She tried hiding it from me, but I heard her crying in her room almost every night. I hope I don't come across as a Grinch who's trying to ruin the holidays for everyone else, because there was once a time when I absolutely adored Christmas. It was usually one of the few reprieves our family had from my father's wickedness. Maybe it was his eggnog mixed with bourbon that did it, but he always seemed a little less mean on Christmas. Growing up, my mother had told me all about the legend of jolly old St. Claus, a plump, red-nosed man who rode on a magical sleigh driven by stags and brought people presents. It may sound dumb, but that story filled me with hope. My family had always been pretty poor, and the idea that there was a man out there who dedicated one night of the year to distribute gifts out of the kindness of his heart was really inspiring to me. Every year I would write him a letter, usually asking for some toy or the latest gadget that all the kids at school were getting. My 7th Christmas was different though. I had sort of begun to grow out of the legend of Santa Claus, especially with the apparent lack of results. I wasn't even planning on writing a letter that year, but Mom encouraged me to give it one last try. I really wanted a Nintendo 64, but something else was more important. For years, I had watched my mother suffer at the hands of my father, and as a young boy who could do nothing about it, it really hurt me. I knew it was wrong, and so I asked Santa for help. I asked if he could make my mom happy again. I took the letter and folded it up, leaving it under a plate of cookies and a tall glass of milk by the tree, as was my tradition. "You still believe in that horse shit, do ya?" My father's gruff voice slurred the words as I set the gift down. I turned back to him, seeing his bearded face contained droplets of eggnog. His pajama pants were worn and dirty, and his stained Metallica t-shirt was on its last leg. He gave a grumbling laugh as we met eyes. "What a fucking concept, huh? Some fat guy that brings presents to everybody? Ain't nobody in the damn world gonna give you shit for free like that." He took a gulp from his glass and sighed. "Well, not if you're on the naughty list," I pensively responded. My father's drunken ire turned back to me, and I felt my heart sink. But then he laughed. "Yeah, gotta be a good boy, huh? You've been a good boy this year?" I shrugged and wavered on my feet. "I think so." He grunted and shook his head. "Yeah, we'll see about that." His vision drifted back to his TV, and I just left. I didn't ever want to interact with my father more than I had to. I went back upstairs, and my mom and I had put on the Rudolph story in her room. We sat and watched for a while, and Mom seemed genuinely happy in that moment. The snow was heavy that year, and I watched it fall in droves outside my bedroom window. The wind howled and tore through the yard, and our little rundown home rattled with the onslaught of winter. The credits began playing, and I rose to turn the TV off. My mom was fast asleep by that point. I put the cassette back in its case and walked over to the window to glimpse at the storm outside. It was almost hypnotizing the way it fell and blanketed everything so evenly. I stood there for a while, just watching it, and the houses on the street were lit in a flamboyant display of red, green, and yellow lights, all the occupants nestled in for the night in anticipation of the coming Christmas morning. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye further down the street. There was a man walking alone in the blizzard. The snowfall was so heavy that I could barely even see him at first. As he drew nearer, I got a better sight. He was wearing a red coat and matching pants, with fluffy white fur around his wrists, ankles, and running down the center of his chest. I immediately recognized his attire right away. It was Santa. I didn't see a beard though, and he looked quite a bit skinnier than I had been told. He wore a hood over his head, with no signs of his signature cap underneath. He then paused right in front of our house and looked up. Immediately, I withdrew from the window, knowing full well that glimpsing Santa was a surefire way of ending up getting caught on the naughty list. I couldn't believe it, though. He had actually come. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I heard something strange. It sounded like the front door was creaking open. I rose from the ground and found that he was no longer outside the window. I thought that was weird, and Santa was supposed to come down the chimney anyway, right? I then, of course, realized that our chimney was much too small for a fully grown man to fit down. I heard his footsteps echo from the floor below, and despite knowing it was a bad idea, I decided I had to get a closer look. As carefully as I could, I pushed the door to my room open and tiptoed my way to the top of the stairs. That's when I saw him. He had his back turned to me, facing the tree with something in his hands. I stepped carefully onto the stairs, but they creaked as I did. Instantly, Santa whipped around and stared up at me. I felt my heart quiver in my chest as we both just stared at one another. His hood was still up, and I couldn't see his face beneath. My father was out cold in his armchair, with the TV still flickering in the background. Santa set down what was in his hands and turned fully to face me. He then lifted one arm, and his gloved index finger wagged slowly back and forth. I knew what that meant, and nodded quickly before scurrying back to my room. I just hoped I hadn't ruined it for myself by seeing him. I stayed in my room for the rest of the night in eager anticipation. Down below, I heard a slight commotion emanate from the ground floor. It almost sounded like someone was fighting, but I reasoned that it must have just been Santa hoisting his bag of goodies around. Soon after, I heard the door open and shut a second later. I didn't dare venture down the stairs again, and next thing I knew, I was waking up. The sun was shining bright outside, reflecting light around the street and in the windows. Mom greeted me as I awoke, and the two of us made our way downstairs. Mom seemed apprehensive, but lightened a bit from the excitement that I had. After all, Santa had actually shown up, and I couldn't wait to see what he had brought. Mom smiled as I ran ahead, and I felt as though my wish had actually come true. That changed when we got downstairs, though, and Mom's face contorted into terror before letting out a gut-wrenching scream. My father sat on his usual chair, his eyes wide and jaw slacked open. His neck had several cuts and bruises along them, and he wasn't moving. He didn't even wake up when my mom screamed. Mom panicked and dialed 911, but there was never any hope of saving him. Mom tried shooing me out of the room, but not before I saw what was by the tree. The cookies and milk were gone, and in their place was an envelope and a box wrapped with red and green Christmas paper. Mom ushered me to my room as the emergency crews and police arrived. They performed their routine down below while I inspected the gift. I opened it up and nearly fainted at the sight of a brand new Nintendo 64 console. I was overjoyed and immediately began setting it up. I paused though, remembering the note that had been attached to it. I opened it. Dear Tyler, I am sorry that my gift took so long to arrive. You've been a very good boy, and you deserve much more than you have gotten. You are a very special young man, and I know you will grow up to be a wonderful person. I hope you enjoy your gift, and I hope that you and your mother can grow together and heal from the things that you have been through. Thanks for always believing, and take care of your mom for me. Love, Santa Claus. P.S. Thanks for the cookies. My father was declared dead soon after that, and preparations were made to lay him to rest. Mom was at first incredibly distraught by what had happened. I think it was more fear of the future than it was sorrow for my father's sudden murder. That's how I read it anyway. Mom managed to find a good job soon after that, and she and I worked to rebuild our lives together. It took her a while, but eventually my wish did come true. Mom began to smile again. My older brother Tommy never came back home, and at first I didn't understand why. He was my best friend, and I missed him dearly. I held on to that letter from Santa and still have it to this day. Many years later, I found something in an old box of my brother's belongings. It was one of his journals, and his handwriting looked remarkably similar to the note that Santa had left me all those years ago. "3 years before I was born, my mother and father had their first child. He lived for a mere 7 minutes before his breathing stopped and he died. I've never inquired as to what caused him to stop breathing. A little over a year after this terrible incident, my parents had a daughter, and then 2 years after her, I was born. Naturally, my parents had no reason to tell me about my older brother, and even as we all got older, the story was never told to me, presumably because it was too painful to recall. If the following events had never occurred, I might not have ever found out about him at all. In early December during my junior year of high school, the family gathered around the Christmas tree to load it up with the ornaments we had gathered over the years. Our family had continued to grow after my birth. My parents had added another son and daughter. My parents had bought each of us an ornament each year, so after adding those to the stockpile that they had owned before we were born, we always had one hell of a time fitting all of the ornaments onto the tree. This year was no different, but we pushed and we slid and we shoved and eventually found some green for all of them. In addition to the ornaments, we had a fairly nice manger set that was placed underneath the tree. It had the whole damn birth party, and of course contained a wooden crib in which laid a figurine of baby Jesus. After my siblings and I had set this up, we stood for a minute or two to admire our work, and then we each went our separate ways and on with life. The day after setting the tree up, I walked into the living room to find one of my ornaments on the ground. It was the first ornament that had been given to me and had "Firstborn Son" etched into its face. The bright bronze had become cloudy over the years, but the ornament was sentimental, so it always managed to find a prominent place on the tree. I found the spot I had thought it had fallen from and rehung it before walking through the room. I passed through the room the next day to find the ornament again on the ground, and again I hung it back up. I tried to hang it in a different spot this time, assuming the weight had allowed it to slide from a thin branch, but to no avail, as it was on the ground the following day as well. I placed it back on the tree, and was not too surprised when I came in the next day to find the ornament missing from the spot. What did surprise me, however, was that the ornament was not on the ground, but was instead sitting on the coffee table a few feet away. I assumed my mother was having the same problem with the ornament and had just picked it up and placed it on the table, so I stopped in the kitchen to ask her about it. She was doing the dishes, and when I asked, she turned around with a funny look on her face and told me that she had been picking up the ornament too each time she walked into the room. For the next few days, each time I walked into the room, I continued to find the ornament off the tree. But now the location had changed. It was no longer lying in random spots on the floor or on the table like it had been before. Each time I walked into the room now, the ornament was inside of the roofed manger, leaning against the crib with the Jesus figure. I was young, and I'm sure that didn't help prevent me from thinking that things were adding up a little strangely. It seems really stupid now, but I grew up in a semi-religious family, and something about finding my firstborn son ornament leaning against Jesus every day appeared to me to be a harbinger of something evil that would cometh my way. The non-surprising thing is, nothing ever happened to me. Obvious, I suppose, but my dad, my no-nonsense, get out of my face with your stupid paranormal shit dad, had something happen to him. He tended to work in his basement office until the wee hours of the morning. Most of that time was actually filled with him sleeping in his chair, as evidenced by him springing up, feigning awareness every time I would go into the basement late at night. In the early hours of the morning on December 23rd, he was, as usual, down in the basement. Around 2 a.m., he was awakened by footsteps crossing down the first-floor hallway above his head. He decided he would come up and see who was up, and then continue upstairs to bed. As he came up the basement stairs, he could hear the person walking through the kitchen on the other side of the door, but when he opened it, the person had just crossed into the dining room. He followed the steps through the kitchen and around the bend, but again was too late. The footsteps had beat him around the turn and into the living room. He rounded the corner and was surprised to see an empty room and no longer hear the footsteps. From the other room, they had appeared to stop at the Christmas tree. As he stood there, scanning the space and trying to figure out what he had heard, he noticed an object lying on the ground towards the middle of the room. As he walked up to it and started bending over, he realized there were actually two objects lying in the middle of the living room floor: baby Jesus and the firstborn son ornament that was lying against his side. The next day, my dad told us all of the story at breakfast. My parents must have known that I was feeling a little unsettled from it all, so they decided to finally tell me what they had kept a secret for 16 years. They told me about their happiness at getting pregnant, the 9 long and exciting months my mom had carried my brother, and their feeling of complete desolation and absolute loss when he had died. They told me how it still hurt, especially around the holidays, and at first I assumed this was because everyone becomes sentimental around the holidays. But then they told me the real reason. My brother had been born and died on December 23rd at 2 a.m. Last night had been the 20th anniversary of his death. My school had a yearly tradition around Christmas. The teachers would rally all the students of our small town school to write a letter to Santa. The teachers all collaborated and emphasized to us that they knew Santa's real address, and what we wrote would be sent to him. I don't know whether my parents never religiously drilled the idea of Santa into me, or if I was just a weird kid, but throughout my childhood I never believed he was real. So I always felt this idea of entertaining this letter scheme was below me. To me, this was just a silly way for the teachers to get kids excited for the holiday. In school, I was one of the rough kids. Even teachers had an apprehension of being around me, scared my temperament was not limited to just kids. Hindsight helps me say this, but at the time I thought it was everyone else who was weird. I attribute this all to my uncle and what he did. He was a brute. When my parents weren't around, which was a lot, he was the one to look after me. During those many nights, he would be rough with me, make me try beer, and tell me about illicit things I was woefully ill-prepared to know, all for the delusion that he was making me tough, when in reality it made me closed off, only able to express my emotions through violence and hate. Each year I never participated in writing the letters, but when I did I'd often just scribble insults or crude doodles. But every so often I'd notice something. A handful of the kids would come back after Christmas break raving that Santa brought them exactly what they had asked for. They would talk about how Santa left them a letter saying they were especially good that year, and brought their wildest dreams to life. Kids from poor families would get the latest game console, or lonely children got the pet of their dreams. One kid even claimed his mother's illness was taken away by Santa. In my pessimistic attitude, I just drummed it all up to the excuse that the teachers gave the letters to the parents. Another reason I never took part in writing the letter. I was also scared my uncle would catch wind and would judge me for what I secretly desired. The pattern was undeniable. Kids were getting what they wanted, and in some way, if it had worked for me, the letters sent to my parents was an interesting way to slyly let them in on what my uncle was doing. To just help tip off my parents at what was going on behind their backs. All to avoid a lesson drilled into me by my uncle that snitches get stitches, literally. A mantra which kept me quiet for far too long. One year I grabbed a pen and ham-fisted a simple letter. I apprehensively wrote that I never wanted to see my uncle again, that I wished Santa would just take him away. I finished the note off, also asking for a puppy. Hey, I was a kid, who didn't want a puppy at my age? Something my parents never really knew, since wanting a pet was girly according to my uncle. When some of the more outspoken kids confronted me about the idea of participating in such an event I was so vocal against, I simply told them that I wrote the nastiest letter to the head teacher. I told wild details which had the kids rolling in laughter, in a way adding to my persona, a metaphor for the facade I had built up. Christmas came around, everything happened as it did every year, a dysfunctional family dinner, and the awkwardly quiet opening of thoughtless gifts. Despite the ritual not changing, I was broken. I berated myself for hoping the little hope I had left, only for it to be wasted. From then on, my life was turbulent. I had basically lost all hope, and for many years after I lost friends, ruined relationships, and threw away my opportunities, all because of the attitude. Inside, I never really felt like a bad person, but it was just how I expressed myself. And then something amazing happened. Someone saw that. My first long-lasting relationship was with someone that understood how I felt inside. She was very patient. She had to be. She stood by me through many rough years, something that I really commend her for. Though I didn't see it at the time, my life with her was the best years I could have asked for. Sadly, it didn't last forever. Time grinded away at the relationship, my unmoving attitude keeping me still as a rock as she pushed forward in life. Eventually, the distance was too much and she had no choice but to leave. It was her leaving that finally shook me enough. A wake-up call. I hated how I had become a slave to myself, always saying I wanted to change but never truly lifting myself from my spot and taking the necessary steps forward. Admittedly, I started seeking professional help in hopes of winning my girlfriend back, but after starting, I couldn't stop, and soon I was doing it for myself and no one else. This is not to say it was easy. Family gatherings brought everything back, and I had a reputation. I was terrified of breaking it. But privately, I was starting to edge out of my shell. I started with therapy sessions. Opening up about everything after keeping it inside for so long released so much tension. I found myself shedding tears, something unheard of about me if you knew who I was. Switching personalities is hard when surrounded by people who know you as a certain way. So I took to some online apps to meet new people who didn't know me at all. A fresh start. To contrast my life, I ended up choosing events and activities that I made fun of throughout my early years. I met up to play video games instead of drinking beer that I secretly hated in rough bars. I spent time learning the game Magic the Gathering rather than poker nights that always ended with a little scuffle. Hell, I even did D&D. To my surprise, I started feeling something I hadn't felt for as long as I could remember. The warm feeling of joy. I had missed that my whole life. I always knew it was in me, and I was saddened somewhat by how long it took for it to come out. But that was overshadowed by the bellowing feelings I now had. I used that energy. I took to amending things with the people I hurt. Through social media like Facebook and Twitter, I hunted down the people I wronged throughout my school life and after. Some moved far away, so I could only message them. Often they initially thought I was messing with them, in complete disbelief that I even contemplated showing a softer side. Some, unfortunately, didn't accept my apology, something that I understood and settled on the notion that I tried. I became a new person. That is the year when my uncle went missing. It was out of nowhere, around midwinter. He was healthy, active, and up to his usual shenanigans, so it was a shock when I received the call that he never came back from one of his nights out. Searches were made, posters were hung, and notices were sent. However, no trace was ever found. It was like he up and disappeared into thin air. Christmas was not long after, and things were initially quiet, an empty seat weighing heavy on our family's minds. I could see the family was not enthused, so I did something unexpected. I took initiative. I started reading the jokes from the Christmas crackers we pulled before our meal. At first my family was shocked, but they soon joined in. I heard something I hadn't heard from my family in a long time. Genuine laughter. We played festive games afterwards, despite being full to the brim with Christmas dinner. I made a fool of myself, and I thank my parents for not making a big deal out of it. I was a changed man. In the end of the night, we opened our presents. Most gifts were thoughtless as usual, remnants of how Christmases used to be. However, my gifts lit up the room. Each one carried a level of thoughtfulness they'd never seen before. Feelings I kept inside for so long materialized and displayed for all to see. Something they all picked up on and vowed to top the next year. The last gift was an odd-looking box with my name on it, topped with a small envelope. Some thought it was from my uncle before he disappeared, though I doubted it was, as he never really got me anything before. I started with the card, written in the cleanest cursive I had ever seen. It was addressed directly to me. The message was brief, with talk of how good I was that year, and wishes that I got everything I'd asked for. I started to think it was from one of my childhood classmates that I reconnected with. My heart jumped up to my throat when I heard a noise bounce around inside. Despite years of cultivating a hardened composure, the sounds I heard froze me for a moment. Panicked, I ripped open the package and looked down, as two adorable bright eyes stared back at me and barked.